which is not particularly appealing. So, this should work. All right. So, Book of Judges. Where did the term come from? And why is it related to because nowadays when we hear the word judge, it's Your Honor and Judge Judy and the people who hold court. That's not quite what these are. They have a similar, if you'll allow me to go down a small linguistic rabbit hole. The root idea behind judge comes from justice. Judge, judgment, justice, all part of the same family. And in our day and age, judges serve justice in courts through the law. These kind of judges are local leaders that bring about God's justice. And oftentimes they do it through leadership and deliverance. But, unfortunately, even though we start out, they're all given the same title of judge, but not all judges are created equal. The book is organized to be not just a loop, but a downward spiral of the judges getting worse and worse, and the morals of the people getting worse and worse, until they circle the drain, and you can think of a toilet analogy, where it just circles it until it goes in and gets flushed out. But what's the information? This is one of the first books where the author is a lot more of something that we need to pay attention to, because with Joshua, we had a pretty good idea that Joshua wrote a pretty good deal of it, and then it got some editing. But Judges, there is no real central character. It's not named after anyone, and even in the New Testament, we're not given any hints of this person wrote that. There are some theories. One of the most leading is that it was Samuel who put this together. Another theory is that it was written a little later than Samuel, during David or Solomon's reign, where it was looking back and recording the history. Why are these people asking for a king? They're rejecting God. Versus in Judges, one of the refrains, especially in the later appendices, is that in those days there was no king, and people did what was right in their own eyes. So, does this point to something past? Something before the king came up and they saw how bad it was? Or was it past Saul and into the reign of great David and great Solomon, where they were people after the Lord's own heart? We aren't entirely certain. We have some theories, but what we can say is that it was written by some prophet not too long after the events that it details. Unfortunately, we can't get much more specific than that.
This period of Judges is what, 300-400 years?
Mm-hmm.
So it could be a person like Samuel that wrote it looking back, but it couldn't have been written during that time, because that's a long time for one author.
Yeah. There's a possibility that there were, choose my words carefully, divine inspiration does not exclude the use of sources. Like in the beginning of, now I'm blanking, I think it's Luke's Gospel, where he's writing to Theophilus that I have gone into great detail and studied this. So presumably he went up, he found records, he talked to people, he got memories, he used sources. Does that mean he was not inspired? No. God gave the words to the person, and it is backed up by those sources. So tying this back in, it is possible that there were recordings of these acts of these judges that stuck around from the time of their writings and were kept for later generations. But it is not one person that was alive and writing down all these events as they were happening. Any questions? Themes. We saw Judges really does carry on where Joshua left off. In the Pentateuch, we had the story of Israel where they saw all these great signs of God, but they still grumbled and they still doubted and they rebelled against God. And that generation got killed off. A new generation was raised up before God, and they were led by Moses and Joshua. They fulfilled God's promise. They conquered the Holy Land. And at the end of Joshua's life, he told them, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods that your ancestors served back in Egypt or the Lord. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And all the people there said, yes, we agree with you. We will serve the Lord. And the last sentence of Joshua is that all the people of that generation and their elders led the people on to serving the Lord. Unfortunately, this is not a case of she was a widow until the day she died. This was a case of he didn't have a cavity until he was 8 years old. Meaning that after that, the thing did happen, and they fell away. But it wasn't just a small step up, it was... The first judges are arguably less interesting because the stories about them are fairly simple, but as it gets later, as the judges are later and later, the stories of them are more and more interesting because they're so flawed and fallible. Until eventually it culminates in Samson, who, as much as Christ-like stories sometimes like to just show the good side of him, honestly, he was a wreck. He was, for all his strength, he was incredibly ungodly, where it seems that it's not even going because of a sense of justice, but because he's just mad. He doesn't deliver the Philistines because they're oppressing God's people. He attacks the Philistines because they wronged him personally. And that's just tragic. And again, the themes, literary features. there is the generational leading. One generation will serve him for the life of one judge, but then the next, they go back and backslide. And this is where we get the cycle or spiral, where, okay, the people, they're worshiping God, but then generation dies off and they start adopting the practices of their neighbors, and then before long, they're practicing outright idolatry. And then, because they abandoned the Lord sends oppression to wake them up. Those neighbors that they thought they were going to be so chummy with, well, now they're being a thorn in your side. And then, in the midst of their oppression, the people then cry out to God. God sends a judge who delivers them, and then you get a generation that's faithful to the Lord, only for the cycle to repeat, getting a little worse every time. However, a thing to note, as I said previously, judges are not kings. They are not uniters of all the 12 tribes to go and fight against their enemies. A lot of the times, they unite a couple tribes or whoever's in the area to overthrow the local oppressors. And that changes when we get to Samuel, where we see that everyone is united as one force. And sometimes that's good, but a lot of the times when your leader is bad, the entire nation feels the brunt. Into the outline, it starts out okay. You get a general overview of the conditions in Canaan after the death of Joshua. People followed him for the generation that grew up under him. And they were even going to try to continue on with what he told them, to continue conquering. And so they went up to the Lord, they asked him, okay, who should go and fight? And they get a person, Judah should go and fight, and they go, but then things lose steam. The enthusiasm flags, the victories aren't flowing in quite as quickly as they'd like, and so the people settle down, and they start talking to their neighbors, and adopting the pagan practices of the natives that led God to effectively bring judgment down upon them through the Israelites. And so God says, okay, you want to have it your way then. If you want to go against my will and leave these pagans living in your land, they will be a thorn to you and oppress you. Then we get into the cycle of the judges. It gives another overview of the time after the great successes of Joshua. Things are looking a little less rosy, but it's still mostly okay. Othniel, the first judge, goes up and fights the Cushan Rishamites. Rishathaim. Nothing too fancy about him. He's just good guy, does a bang-up job. Eglon versus Ehud. They go from perfectly able guy leading a full army, then just a step lower. Someone who's left-handed. In our day and age, being left-handed, I mean, it's annoying. You can't get left-handed scissors. Everything's made for right-handed people. But back then, the left hand, There's a reason why there's a reason why sinister, which just means left, has such a negative connotation. Back before we had flowing water, the way that people would keep their hands clean is set aside a hand for less clean tasks. Everything that you need for polite company is done with your right hand. Everything that would be done in less than polite company, scratching where the sun, wiping where the sun don't shine, or cleaning up less than clean things, that was all done with your left hand. And the only reason that someone would be left-handed is if their right hand was crippled. So we go from firm body person, now it's someone who's crippled. But God uses him. He puts a sword on the opposite side of where most people would check, and when he goes to bring the offering to the king, pulls out the surprise sword, sticks it into the old... I can't remember the Latin term. Not Oedipus, but the old fat king. And the handle sinks in so deep that it's entirely swallowed up by his fat. Don't think like 3 foot long swords. This is long dagger. And then he escapes, and without the leader, Israel is able to win a victory. But it's not the great and grand victory of Othniel, where all the people went up and fought against their enemy. This is a cripple killing off the leader in basically an assassination. That's a little less than grand. Then we get the first appearance of the Philistines, and they're fighting against Shamgar. And he too saved Israel. Didn't have an army, he just had an ox goad and used what he had. And then, step down from that, we get the account of Gideon. Nope, I skipped one. Deborah and Barak. In a lot of our less... So Barak was supposed to be the judge, the leader who would lead God's people in battle and get a victory, but he was a coward. He didn't think that people would listen to him, and he said, "Yeah, Deborah, you're the prophetess. You come with me. I don't trust God to do what he says if you don't come with me." And so God told him, "Okay, but you're going to lose the honor from this." And as God told him, so it happened. They won a battle, but what ultimately happened is that Barak didn't get the honor of killing the enemy general. The enemy general went into a neutral camp, the camp of a neutral person, and then she killed him while he was sleeping. That's even less honorable than having a cripple assassinate him. Now this is basically the level of, yeah, he kind of just tripped over and died. There is no honor for Israel here. Their leader is a wimp and a coward, and when the man didn't stand up, God called a woman to shame him. And then we get the Midianites and Amalekites against Gideon. Oh, but this is another one of the judges that Christ-lights a lot of the time just kind of cut off the worst parts of the story, because he doubted God quite a lot. He asked for sign after sign, and then finally, when he gets enough courage to go and do what God told him to do, he then just tries to take the glory. He tells the people to yell, "For the Lord and for Gideon!" So that's already not particularly great. And then he goes and he tries to unite even more and pursue his enemies across the Jordan. But unfortunately, the people there weren't quite willing to join in with his army, and so there was quite a bit of bad blood between them. So now we have someone who's, now to step down to a person who's egotistical, but also incredibly doubting, and terrible interpersonal skills, who actually ends up killing some Israelites because of his ego. Not a great look. Abimelech is actually the first child of a judge, and he tried to set himself up as a king, and quickly became a tyrant, before eventually being killed very ignobly by having a millstone dropped on his head from a tower that he was sieging. Yeah, not exactly grand and glorious. Tola and Jair, we got a lot of minor judges. I don't remember which ones.
Well, not.
Should have made better notes. So, Tola and Jair were the children, were brothers with Abimelech, and were judges as well. Then Jephthah, we don't get too much about him. He went out as judge, but because he picked up practices from the Canaanites around him, he swore an oath to the Lord that if you give me the victory, then the first thing I see when I come back, I will sacrifice to you. And he comes back, and his one and only beloved daughter comes out to greet him. And not great. He did sacrifice her, whether that means putting her to death or putting her to be a temple virgin in the tabernacle. But we see that he made a hasty oath and effectively was punished for it. Then Isban, Elon, Abdon, three minor judges who almost led the people into idolatry and civil war. And then we get the absolute crowning achievement of terribleness with Samson. Starts out so good where we get news about Samson's birth. He's going to be special. The Spirit of the Lord is going to be upon him from birth. And he's going to be a Nazirite from birth. Here's a few simple things that he has to do, and the Lord is going to use him. But then we have a little time skip, and what do we see him doing but not being able to keep it in his pants, and deciding that, yeah, I know God told us not to marry these Canaanite women, but, yeah, you know, she's really hot, so I really want to marry her. Parents, go to her parents, pay the dowry and do all that, and I want to marry her, no one else. But because he's also a smug little Nazirite, he decided, "Oh yes, I'm going to tell a riddle that no one else will be able to that no one will be able to solve, and we're going to make ridiculous bets on it." And when his wife gets pressured and gives up the answer to the riddle, and he eventually loses the bet, he effectively goes and has a murderous hissy fit, where he decides, okay, I'm going to pay my debt by just killing everyone and taking their cloaks, and here you go. But that's not quite the end of the story, because when he went off and had his murderous hissy fit, the father of the bride said, well, looks like he's not coming back. Probably doesn't want her after she kind of betrayed him like that, so let's just marry him off to one of the guests. So when Samson finally calms down, he goes to see his wife and finds out that, yeah, because of what you did, yeah, we just married her off to someone else. He went off and had another destructive hissy fit and destroyed a lot of the Philistines' crops. Great look, Samson. And then we get the classic Samson and Delilah, where he did not learn his lesson the first time, and he still couldn't keep it in his pants, and he got in with another woman who was not able to keep his secrets, but not before the Philistines got really mad at him, and this is just so interesting that I gotta share it. There's an account where Samson was staying in a city explicitly with a prostitute, and because the Philistines were out to get him, they closed the gates so that Samson would be stuck in, and they would be able to effectively siege him out. But then in the middle of the night, he got up, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and then he just tore the gates off and carried them off. A lot of power, a lot of strength, but absolutely no morals and no responsibility. He's just the worst. And then, you know the classic Samson and Delilah. He almost learned his lesson, where instead of telling the woman who gives him the puppy dog eyes a secret, this time he lies to her multiple times before eventually he gets worn down and he tells her, he gets captured, his hair is shorn, and then in the end he commits effectively suicide by bringing down all of God's enemies with him. Not great at all. But that has absolutely nothing on what just the common people were doing at this time. Because the book of Judges doesn't end with the accounts of the judges. There's a few appendices showing just how crazy everything had gotten. The first is showing how crazy things had gotten religiously. The tale of Micah's shrine, where this supposedly Israelite made idols because apparently he hadn't heard of the first commandment. But he did know enough to know that the Levites were supposed to be priests. So when a wandering Levite came to his house, he showed his gods and said, "Hey, you're a Levite, you're a priest. Why don't you stay here and worship at my shrine with all of my idols?" And the Levite was like, "Yeah, that sounds like a good idea." And no one thought there was anything wrong with this. And to make things worse, the tribe of Dan wasn't able to conquer the land that the Lord had given them. And so they said, well, if we can't beat our enemies there, why don't we go find someplace else that we can conquer? And they found this town and said, oh, hey, that looks... We kind of need food and stuff, so why don't we go raid this town with our fellow Israelites in it. That's okay, right? And so they went and raided the town, and when they did, they found Micah's shrine and found the gods and were like, "Oh, sweet! Gods!" And even better, there's a Levite priest here. And the Levite priest just like, "Don't kill me, I'll come with you and be the priest for these gods." How did anyone think this was okay? And if that wasn't quite enough, as if that was just too moral and highbrow, he also showed just the absolute moral degradation. So there was another Levite who was traveling around. He stopped at the town of Gibeah, and what effectively happened was a recreation of Sodom and Gomorrah without the angels there to save people. So the people came, surrounded the town. "You have a traveler, send him out here. We want to know him," which is the biblical slang for, doing the do. And so we had the same thing with Lot, where the owner of the house says, "Don't do this wicked thing." And so to try to mitigate their evil, the Levite happened to have a concubine traveling with him, because that's just to put a little icing on the cake. He had a concubine with him that they sent out to effectively be the sacrificial lamb. And trying to think of a somewhat polite way to say this, but I don't think it does justice, so I'll just say it outright. She was raped to death. And then in the morning, when the Levite sees this, to make a statement, since she was already dead, he cut up the body into 12 pieces, sent it to all the tribes to let them know what a just ungodly, unmoral thing happened. And once everyone actually got the message and received the news of what happened and why they received this severed piece of a woman, they realized, yeah, this is messed up. So they gathered an army from all the tribes, went to war against the people at the town of Gibeah, but, because two wrongs make a right, they made an oath that, because they did such a terrible thing, we're not going to give none of us are going to give our daughters to the men of this tribe. So they went to war. They had a crusade, effectively. They finally won. But after that, they looked around and said, okay, that's destroyed. The sin is avenged. But is it really God-pleasing that we destroyed an entire tribe of our brothers? But we made an oath not to give any of our daughters to them in marriage, and they need to marry to have children. Oh, we know what we'll do. We'll just have all our daughters gather in this harvest festival, and then just give the men the go-ahead to go in, choose whichever one they want, and carry her off. That way, we won't be technically breaking our oaths, because we won't be giving our daughters away, and the tribe will be able to survive. Isn't that just three wrongs making a right? in those days, Israel had no king. And it was very messed up. And anyone who thinks that the Bible would make for a good kids movie has obviously never read the Judges. It is a terrifying look into the depths of human sinfulness. It is, and as much as people like to think that we've gotten better and more sophisticated, honestly, we can, in different parts of the world, even maybe in a few years into the future in different parts where people get riled up enough, we still see these same attitudes come out to play. Where we don't care about anyone else. This is what we're here for. And we don't care what we have to destroy or burn or deface so long as we get what we want out of it. We can look back and say, oh man, it's so terrible what happened to them, but honestly it is the same sin in their hearts that led them to do that is still in our hearts. And without God, that's where we end up. Whether it be one generation, 2, or 3. The most terrifying thing is for God to remove His grace. For God to remove His law, I should say. Because once that curb is removed, people drive wherever they want. And as much as people joke about pedestrians being more points, when people are learning to drive, if people have no Godfulness, no empathy, that's what happens. So, after that downer of a summary,
I'm sensing you're really getting into this.
Judges is an incredibly emotionally charged book. And I mean, after I had to hold it in to speak softly and pitch my voice up to work with the microphone, I'm just letting it all out now. Anything from the discussion topics catching your eye?
Pastor Hodge was left-handed. And I can remember sending him a text message about Ehud, the Benjamite, son of Gera. And he just took off on that. He said, Ehud is one of my favorite characters in the Bible because he was left-handed. At the top you have women and judges. And it seems like women take a real beating in Judges, but this story about Sisera and the woman that literally nailed him was in Jael, and to me that's such a cool story. He comes in, falls asleep on the 10th floor, and she takes a little hammer or whatever, and
10 stick right in the head.
he's done for.
Yeah, it's, on the one hand, women are shown to be in some ways they're shown better than a lot of their male compatriots. When Barak is, do not step up, then the women must, to the men's shame. It's not a violation of the headship principle for women to step up in the absence of proper male leadership. But at the same time, there is a very visceral reality that women are the greater sufferers, that they are the ones who are much more the victims. Because it's we see with Jephthah's daughter, that's a whole can of worms that you can do to try to figure out which is more likely. But there's Jephthah's daughter, and then the Levite's concubine in the appendix that they are ultimately painted as very much victims of sin, with no way to have recompense other than the males that were supposed to take care of them. Is 7:30. That's our 45 minutes, unless there's anything else really begging for anyone's attention. All right, then we'll close with prayer. Lord, you alone are righteous and just, and you alone have the power to cleanse our hearts from sin. Please forgive us all of our sins of thought, word, and deed, and give us the strength to truly live as your children. We pray for your blessing, especially on our nation, that you may give peace and security, that we may dwell in peace and spread your word to your glory. In your name we pray. Amen. Despite all of the doom and gloom, next week we get a spot of light looking at Ruth, which, considering it's a much shorter book, much easier to summarize, we can actually get into it a whole lot more than trying to summarize 300 years of history.